The rituals have been very, very simple and not sacramental. So there is singing, and the singing is perhaps the flux that joins all the individuals together. Very intense, very moving, and perhaps monotonous, but the very monotony has a sadness and a power to it. And their Sobranias are the center, really, and have historically been the center of their communal life. And there's nothing democratic in the meeting.
What you might call a patriarchal administration, where the religion, the beliefs, and the society as a whole is its own governing force. There's Sabrania, for instance. Any matter that comes up, no Doukhobors living in a society who are considered as members of a group will ever attempt doing anything that concerns the group without consulting the rest of the members. And that is where Sabrania comes in. And on top of that, they could have the elders, and over that they have a spiritual leader or a person whom they consider as more advanced in wisdom and philosophy and his vision.
From the circumstances of their origins, the Doukhobor community was always faced sharp divisions and conflicts. There's, in a sense, a conflict of ideology right from the very beginning. On the one hand, they professed a very egalitarian view of life. We are all equal before men, and when questioned by the authorities, they'd say we have no leaders. And yet the fact has been that they've depended very heavily on a strong leadership, a sort of theocracy.
Up to 1840 or thereabouts, the Doukhobors had been living on very fertile land in the southern Ukraine, on the north shore of the Sea of Azov. And then they got into trouble with the authorities, the Tsarist authorities under the Nicholas I regime, which was a pretty harsh one. And they were all banished to mountainous areas of the Caucasus.
In Caucasia, they lived more or less independently and communally. They only had a fund to help their poor and people in distress. They called it as Orphans for Home Fund, but actually it was used for people in case of sudden fire or somebody losing his house and contents or something like that, or a sudden death and people living poor. They always had funds to help such destitute people.
Peter Kalmykov, the last leader of his race, died in 1864. He was succeeded by his wife, Lukaria Vasilevna Kalmykova, the only woman leader of the Doukhobors. She was an imposing and able woman under whom the sect grew prosperous once again. A little while before she died in 1886, Lukaria Kalmykova took into her wooden palace in the Caucasus a young protege called Peter Verygin.
After the death of Lukaria Vasilievna, the leadership split among the Doukhobors, who were, of course, all still in Russia at the time, and the radical group of them allied themselves to Peter Verygin, whereas the other group stayed with the family of Lukaria Vasilievna and maintained complete independence and supported another branch of the leadership. So it was only the Veryginites and the group around them who eventually came to Canada.
Peter Verygin was the most famous of the Doukhobor leaders. He sought at once to renew the old militancy of the sect, and in 1887 he was sent to Siberia. Out of his exile, he advised his followers to reform their lives, to abstain from alcohol and tobacco and meat, to renew their sharing of material goods, to implement their pacifism. Conscription had been imposed on the Doukhobors in 1883. The 7,000 followers of Verygin now decided to resist military service.
My grandfather came from Russia. He was 21 when the Doukhobors decided they would no longer serve in the Tsarist army.
Yes.
And he found himself in a regiment, the only Doukhobor in that particular regiment. And he had to explain to the head of the regiment that he was no longer going to serve in the army. He was sent to Siberia along with quite a lot of other Doukhobors.
Then the people who had remained in the villages carried out a symbolic act of renouncing militarism by raising great pyres in the fields and burning all their arms. This happened in June 1895. The authorities reacted ruthlessly. Cossacks were sent into the offending villages, and their inhabitants were exiled to Georgia. Their plight was brought to the attention of the world by the great novelist Count Leo Tolstoy, and in 1898 the Tsar finally allowed them to leave Russia. A shipload went to Cyprus, but the experiment failed. Canada was the next choice. A delegation of Doukhobors came to Canada in 1898. They were accompanied by Aylmer Maude, the translator of Tolstoy's novels, and by Prince Hilkov, a follower of Tolstoy. The Canadian government agreed to grant them exemption from military service and to give them land under the Homestead Act. The first shipload of Doukhobors left the Russian Black Sea port of Batum in December 1898. There were 3 further contingents. By the time the last landed in Halifax, a total of 7,417 Doukhobors had reached Canada. They proceeded immediately to Saskatchewan, where they set up their villages.
People came to Canada absolutely penniless, as history tells us, with help of Quakers, Tolstoyans, and a lot of friends all over England and United States at that time who answered to Tolstoy's appeal to help Doukhobors. And
the early days on the prairies were hard. There was not enough money to buy stock or other necessities. The first homes were solid shacks. Afterwards, the villages were built like those in Russia. To earn money for basic needs, the men went to work in gangs on the new railroads over the prairies. The women stayed at home to work the land. When there were no horses, they harnessed themselves to the plows to break the virgin prairie. They span their own thread and wove their own cloth. At this time, Peter Verrigan, whom his followers now called the Lordly, was still in Siberia, and in his absence dissensions began to break out. Some villages favored communal ownership. Others, where the peasants had been able to bring a little money from Russia, were disinclined to share their relative prosperity. And then, in 1902, appeared a group of zealots, the first ancestors of the Sons of Freedom. They declared that the animals were their brothers and set their cattle free to roam over the countryside. They dragged their wagons by manpower. They abandoned leather shoes and articles of metal. At times they went naked like Adam and Eve. In October 1902, 400 of them began a march over the autumnal prairies towards an imaginary promised land to the south, where the summer was perpetual and the trees were hung with fruit all the year round. In all, 1,700 Doukhobors, young and old, sick and healthy, joined in the march. When the temperatures fell below zero, they were brought to a halt by the mounted police in Manitoba. Soon afterwards, in December 1902, Peter the Lordly arrived out of exile. He immediately took affairs in hand and started reorganizing the Doukhobors into the Christian community of universal brotherhood.
I'm sure he was a great vision man, and at the same time he was a practical businessman. As far as I know, and as far as I could see at that time. Of course, I was young enough, but I believe he was a good businessman, good organizer.
I know that first years in Saskatchewan, they started producing grain, which is only thing they could do in prairies, as you know. They lived in their individual communities, which we called villages and now call villages, and they had this communal order among themselves. But they had warehouses at Vergen, Saskatchewan, or Yorkton, which produced at wholesale prices most of the essentials for the people, and they came there and took what they wanted for their communities, but then they repaid in wheat at the end of the year where their crops were harvested. They repaid for this into the fund, and that's how this community enterprise, they were able to get this certain cash and provide more goods for the people.
The Christian community now began to prosper. But then there came the first of many disagreements with the Canadian authorities. It changed the whole course of Doukhobor history in this country.
Well, they came to Canada and they were allotted land by the Canadian government on the same basis as other homesteaders were. In other words, there was a quarter section, I believe, allotted to each family. But they wanted to take up land not as individuals, but as a group. And they refused to take the oath of allegiance, which was required of them by the Canadian government. And after they'd been on the land for a few years, the government said that unless they took up the land as individuals, they'd have to leave it.
The majority of the people decided that it would be an infringement on their religious beliefs. It would be against their basic principles of faith to swear the oath of allegiance. They also desired to live a communal way of life. And in order to do that, they found that by purchasing land from private owners in British Columbia, they would be able to bypass that necessity of having to swear the oath of allegiance and of having to acquire individual homesteads. So they decided, and the majority of them moved to British Columbia. Some were in favor of going by the requirements of the regulations with regard to the homesteads and decided to stay. They became what is generally referred to as the independents, whereas the others who moved to British Columbia became the members of the Christian community of Universal Brotherhood.
Community had 21,900 acres in British Columbia, which was around Brilliant, which we know as Kootenays district, extending way to Slocan City and Slocan Valley there, and all around Brilliant area, and Grand Forks, which we know as now. 21,000 in British Columbia and 11,300 acres in Alberta and 34,000 acres in Saskatchewan. Altogether about 67,340 acres. Agriculture, of course, was the main pursuit in Alberta and Saskatchewan because we had to produce grain, and some lands were bought there for that purpose. In British Columbia it was a mixed activity. At the beginning they planted a lot of fruit trees. I have a record of 50,000 fruit trees planted only around Grand Forks in 1918. But I know there were a lot of fruit trees around Brilliant, and I think selling of fruit was one of the industries because we had big packing houses at Brilliant and Grand Forks, and we had a jam factory at Brilliant and one at Grand Forks. It was quite famous, jam all over BC. And then originally, I believe for its own use, community had some portable sawmills, but we had three stationary sawmills. There were two brick factories, one at Grand Forks and one at Yorkton, Saskatchewan, ran by community in Saskatchewan, and of course are very hard to assess them. In 1924 there were periods, you see. By 1924, when community was at its height, possibly community's assets were at $6,410,000. By incorporation, according to the laws, all community property was registered in the names of 14 shareholders, and shareholders were deemed to be the sole owners of community, but knowing that all community enterprises belong to the people, we're obliged. I was a shareholder myself, so I know I held $1 million share.
How deeply did the sharing go down into the details of life?
Well, in some respects, it went pretty deeply. There are, for instance, communal houses that would hold altogether 50 families. At one time they cooked. They had one common oven, cooked and ate together. And originally, members of the Brotherhood, if they worked outside for wages, were to pay their wages into the organization for its common revenue, and then would draw from it correspondingly. Certainly, the Christian community of Universal Brotherhood prospered and grew pretty much under the iron hand of Peter the Lordly Varian. He certainly exerted a very strong one-man rule.
Yes.
And it prospered partly because he imposed a program of pretty severe austerity. In other words, holding down levels of personal consumption in order to save, accumulate, invest, pay off the indebtedness that the organization had assumed.
Yet external pressure and internal events combined to bring the Christian community of Universal Brotherhood to an end during the 1930s. It began with disputes with the provincial government over education, which the Doukhobors feared might harm their ideals.
There was distrust in terms of militarism as the basic one, that killing is wrong, and therefore bring up a child in the teaching of militarism, in the teaching of, in the glorification of heroes and the saluting of the flag, all these factors, and in the worship of the kings and queens, all this was contrary to their equalitarianism emphasis and their search for universal brotherhood.
The schools were built in the Doukhobor districts during the early 1920s, and members of the community were prosecuted for not sending their children to school. Eventually, Peter the Lordly sought the way of compromise.
He sent the child, but he was explained to mother. Some of the mother and father don't want to put the child to the school.
Yes.
Well, he was explained, what is best? If you believe in your religious, there is not right in the school, you teach your child home.
Yes.
Explain what you don't want it check everything from the school.
So the children went sporadically to school. Then in October 1924, Peter the Lordly was killed by a bomb placed in a train traveling from the Kootenay Valley to Grand Forks. Verigan's death is one of the unsolved mysteries of Doukhobor history. No one has produced a clue that might suggest who is responsible. He was buried by mourning thousands, and a great tomb was built over his grave, which overlooks the Kootenay River at Brilliant.
What happened after Mr. Verigan's death in the community? I believe that you went to Russia to find his son. I believe you yourself were one of the party.
Yes. Well, you know, our people always like to have the leader. You know?
Yes.
Always. When the Mr. Verigan died, after about a month, people gather up, worried about that, and they sent us 2 men to the Russia to get Mr. Verigan second.
And you had no difficulty getting into Russia then?
No.
And where did you find him?
Well, we was find him in the villages. You mean Mr. Verigan?
Yes.
In the village. He was living in the village in Don.
On the Don?
Yeah, he was moved from Caucasus to Don Rostov.
In 1927, Peter Petrovich Verigan arrived in Canada to take over the leadership of the Doukhobors. He called himself Chestiakov, the Purger, and he was a more erratic man than his father.
Well, certainly one hears innumerable stories about his tremendous expenditures and the large amounts of money he collected, which apparently did not find their way into the CCUB's coffers.
Yes.
But the evidence is not too clear on that. It may have been purely mismanagement rather than, or it may have been voluntary donations by the members to Shostakov as a person or an individual, rather than a contribution to the organization as such. Perhaps that tendency to differentiate.
Yes.
Peter Petrovich Verigin died in 1939. By that time, the great economic and social experiment of the Christian community of universal brotherhood had already come to an end. It failed for many causes.
One was the Great Depression in the 1930s. Second factor was alleged misappropriation of funds. A third factor was, perhaps an important factor, was the dwindling membership, originally from some 8,000 members to about 2,500 or just over that at the end of the 30s. There was also this rise of the Zealot faction. Partly this accounted for the loss in membership. Some of the Zealots refused to pay the dues to the Christian community of universal brotherhood. Eventually some of these Zealots were evicted because they failed to pay their dues, and yet they reaped the benefits of the community organization.
Of course, the depredations of the Sons of Freedom are an increasing burden, and the several $100,000 of community property had been burned or bombed.
Yes.
Even by the 1930s.
The final blow that destroyed the community was a foreclosure in 1938 by the Sun Life Company of Canada and the National Trust Company. By this time, in spite of all the adverse circumstances, the community was struggling out of its indebtedness.
On death of Verigin, community owed $1,202,000 to its creditors, that's on land mortgages. In that period, up to December 31st, 38, it paid out $740,000 in principal, and $519,000 was remaining at the time of foreclosures.
It was for this amount, $519,000, that the community, with its $6 million in assets, finally went bankrupt.
So the movable assets were all sold, as were the land holdings in Alberta and Saskatchewan. But the provincial government, fearing the effects of just a mass displacement of thousands of Doukhobors from the land that they occupied and hitherto had owned collectively, the government paid the insurance companies off and assumed title to the land, holding it in trust for the members, for the residents. And of course, it's in one sense it was a humanitarian gesture, but on the other hand, it has created serious problems in the relationships of Doukhobors with government. And from another view, it looked almost as if a government had seized or had taken over land and buildings worth several times more than they had paid to get rid of the indebtedness.
So the Doukhobors were left at the end of the 1930s. Their community was broken down. The industries they created had come to an end. Their plant had been seized, and they lived in sufferance on the land that was once their own. This is the prelude to the story of the Doukhobors today, which we shall tell in our second program. In the 1960s, the Doukhobors still live and die in the regions of Canada with which they have been associated for 2 generations. In their cemeteries on the dry hillsides, the men and women who fled persecution in Russia more than 60 years ago lie beside children who are 3rd-generation Canadians. Yet there have been profound changes in Doukhobor life since the Christian community of universal brotherhood was destroyed by bankruptcy in 1938.
one gets a distinct impression that the main Doukhobor villages, settlements, are, well, communities only in the physical sense.
Yes.
That they're a group of houses, of buildings in which people reside. But the members themselves, of course, have become much more mobile with the automobile. In fact, they're very mobile people. They work in a variety of jobs over a wide area. So that one gets the impression there's very little in the way of organized community life.
Yes.
Though they have their religious observances and their halls and so on. But one gets the impression that they're almost as individualistic in their ways as we are.
With the passing of the years, the divisions between the Doukhobors have become steadily more pronounced. There are the Orthodox Doukhobors and the independent Doukhobors, and the Zealots, who are known as the Sons of Freedom.
The Orthodox tend to believe in a spiritual, hereditary type of leadership that has evolved through history, somewhat analogous to the concept of royalty in Europe that many of us know of. The Zealots follow very much the same, with the concept of Sorokin again being a type of hereditary or a spiritual type of leadership, not as opposed to an elected leadership. They feel that your conscience is your leader, and to have a hierarchy is against the whole grain of equalitarianism and Doukhoborism and the search for brotherhood as such.
Today, we often hear of a Doukhobor problem. That problem is closely linked to the divisions between the Doukhobors themselves. It is the problem of a minority within a minority.
Well, of course, you have to break down the so-called Doukhobor problem into a problem of a large religious community, essentially, religiously identified at least, comprising of possibly 17,000 people in British Columbia, of whom not more than 2,500 are identified with a troublesome element. And therefore, you have to say the Sons of Freedom question, which is essentially what we're about. Of the Sons of Freedom, our estimation is that not above 800 or 900 are the hard core of trouble. And therefore, I think we're talking about, say, 1,000 people.
Let us turn first to the Orthodox majority. They are organized in the Union of Spiritual Communities of Christ. Their leader is John Verrigan.
Our people became reorganized into the Union of Spiritual Communities of Christ began in 1938, when the economic community, which was known as the Christian Community of Universal Brotherhood, ceased to function. Each community is represented by representatives who are called trustees, 2 trustees for each community. They in turn hold their conventions and select an executive committee, which is also elected from certain zonal areas. And the executive committee is presently headed by the honorary chairman, the position that I occupy.
And what are your functions as honorary chairman? Do you correspond to the leaders of the past among the Doukhobors?
I believe in a certain sense, but I think that it is necessary to offer a bit of explanation in that regard. In this same document, the Declaration, which tells of our basic beliefs, it is clearly stated that we regard our Savior, Jesus Christ, as our only leader. Now, there may be confusion when one refers to the past persons such as my forefathers in the sense of leaders. They were the ones who headed the organization, and possibly in the eyes of many, they appeared to take the the person of Christ. I believe that that fundamentally is not correct. With the change of times and circumstances, it was found necessary when I was appointed to my present position as honorary chairman to have someone to head the organization to sort of unite the people behind a common purpose and possibly serve symbolically in that office.
Today, the Orthodox Doukhobors still carry on the religious rituals their ancestors began. There is no priest at a Doukhobor meeting. The table with the bread and salt of brotherhood is the symbolic center of the pattern, from which the wings of men and women spread out on either side. The participants bow to each other to acknowledge the divine within all men, and they emphasize spiritual community by the kiss of peace. They have no written liturgy, and their services are sung by the unaccompanied voice. But most of the singing still consists of psalms and hymns. No economic community in the sense of sharing goods among the Orthodox Doukhobors.
That development is in the stage that most of the lands, all of the lands in the Grand Forks area have been repurchased, and a great portion of the land in the area around Brilliant has also been repurchased. We have a few problems in the way at the moment that have stopped this procedure. And then, of course, the great task of rebuilding, housing development, and primarily the irrigation systems will give us quite a job.
The Orthodox Doukhobors have also developed a flourishing series of cooperatives. One of them is the Sunshine Valley Cooperative of Grand Forks.
It started with an idea of a few members of the USCC to form a cooperative, possibly because it stems off to a supply factor that existed during the early stages of the CCUB organization.
And in what year did it actually come into existence?
In 1947, June the 27th. It is just the consumers' cooperatives. We have no producer arm as far as the Sunshine Valley Co-op itself is.
And how many people do you think avail themselves of the services of the co-op?
Some 2,200 families. 1962 sales total to round figure of $1 million. The Sunshine Valley Co-op itself has increased on its premises by building a new supermarket type of food floor, as well as extending premises in other departments. There's also formation of a cooperative flour mill, what is going to be the first of the producer arm of the cooperative movement amongst the members.
There are many cultural activities among the spiritual communities of Christ. One is the youth movement of 700 members.
The aims of our youth organization are cultural enlightenment and spiritual development. Our activities are mainly in 5 categories. These are singing groups, literary and correspondence groups, drama groups, temperance groups.
And then there is the Doukhobor paper, Iskra, or the Spark.
Well, first of all, the aim is communication between our different groups, groups that live in different parts. That's the first aim, and then the second aim is cultural, religious. That is, the aim is to preserve our cultural and religious aspects of life.
Finally, the Orthodox Doukhobors make education a prerequisite of membership, and here they have an extensive program.
We have quite a large centralized school district here in Grand Forks, and out of 1,200 students in the elementary and the secondary schools, about 600 of the students are Doukhobor faith. On the school board, of the 5 trustees on the school board, 2 are Doukhobors, 1 is the vice chairman.
And I understand that the Doukhobors, as well as participating in the general education of the area, also have certain types of education of their own. The Sunday schools, I gather, and also Russian schools.
The Doukhobors have organized, that is, the Union of Spiritual Communities of Christ has organized a Russian school system that they uphold by fees from their own members, that has about 250 children from the ages of 8 to 15 attending 2 nights a week at 2 hours at the session. At our Sunday schools, of course, we teach them basically belief in God, teachings of Jesus Christ. We teach them that the basis of all religions is to do good, and the essence of Christ's teachings is love and nonviolence.
At the other end of the Doukhobor spectrum stand the Sons of Freedom, the zealot minority, less than 3,000 in number. They began to appear 60 years ago, shortly after the arrival of the Doukhobors in Canada. They re-emerged in strength during the early 1920s, when there were disagreements between the Doukhobors and the authorities over the question of education. During the 1930s, they were expelled from the Christian community of Universal Brotherhood. Until their march from the Kootenays to the Pacific coast began in September 1962, they lived in villages on the edge of Doukhobor territory, shack settlements like Crestova and Gilpin. How do the Sons of Freedom regard themselves? Here is one of their spokesmen.
Full term is a Son of Freedom cannot be a slave of corruption.
Yes.
Now that, as many can understand, is likewise taken from the scriptures, where various references are being made about a person becoming free from the limitations of his material self, of his carnal self. And the Doukhobor ideology is one that wants to bring man out from being a slave to his lower carnal self into the evolved spiritual being that Christian philosophy calls for. So that takes in wealth, riches, man's ambition, greed, selfishness, all those things that make up for the things of this world. And the religious things are the religious matters that pertain to the inner man. The inner man must be free and predominant, not the outer man. I think, in short, that the Son of Freedom is one that is free from all his limitations, his carnal and worldly limitations. That is what, in our opinion, does really make a Son of Freedom.
The Sons of Freedom believe they are tied to no land and subject to no earthly ruler.
We believe in just owing allegiance to God.
You don't think of yourselves as citizens of Canada in the legal sense?
Not in that sense, no. Because we believe all children belong to one God. And where we obtain our livelihood doesn't make that much difference, because all men are brothers, and whether they're black or white, whether we're in Canada or whether we're out of Canada. If we can live our own way of life, believing in our God, well, the land itself doesn't make a difference.
The Sons of Freedom have also been the most persistent of the Doukhobors in their opposition to ordinary state-imposed education.
We think that the best education a child can have is to learn how to grow a garden, for instance.
Yes.
How to prune a fruit tree, how to milk a cow, how to obey his parents, for instance. That is all considered as education. So not necessarily what comes from the book. Man is a social being, and if he doesn't learn how to adapt himself to society and live at peace with his brethren, with his fellow neighbors, and learn how to derive his livelihood without exploiting others or believe that he can make something out of the other man by some way that may be considered legal according to the standards of the world, but according to true education that Christ brought, that is a dreadful sin. Or, for instance, war. Majority of educated people accept war as a necessary sin, an evil that this society, educated society, can possibly survive without. To us, there's no such thing. Such education can have not a single place in our thoughts.
In their long struggle against authority, the Sons of Freedom have sometimes resorted to sensational means. Public stripping, burning down their own and other people's houses, even dynamiting railway lines and power pylons. In 1932, 745 Sons of Freedom were arrested in a single month for nudism. 600 were sentenced to 3 years in a special penal settlement on Piers Island in the Gulf of Georgia. Their 300-odd children were segregated in various institutions. In 1947, 83 buildings were burnt down in Doukhobor areas. In 1950, 400 Sons of Freedom were imprisoned for nudism or arson, often for burning their own houses. In 1953, the authorities forcibly took away 170 children from their Sons of Freedom parents and put them in a special institution at New Denver. The last were not released until 1959. From 1958 to 1962, there was a long series of isolated bombings. 2 young Doukhobors were killed by their own explosives. Finally, in the summer of 1962, the inhabitants of Crestova and other zealot villages burned more than 300 of their own shacks and houses. Why do such things happen?
I think it's all a form of protest, of trying to get back to the simplicity of what they consider early life to have been. And in our own day, of course, they resent the modern world and all the evils of materialism connected with it.
Much of the, I'd say, aberrant behavior, particularly among the Sons of Freedom, perhaps derives from very sincerely held principles, one could say almost fanatically, that people believe in almost fanatically, but in a situation where they simply can't be applied. Now we have the same sort of thing in a way. People of Christian nations preach peace, goodwill. Well, in our society we have murderers, thugs, hoodlums. One very rarely finds them among Doukhobors, but perhaps there's a process of selection of the type of individual that becomes how do we call it, a deviant along criminal lines in our society, perhaps in Doukhobor society, tends to become selected into the Sons of Freedom and carries out some of these activities under the guise of religious fervor. Yes. And perhaps the Sons of Freedom perhaps condone such action under perhaps misguided religious beliefs, where in our society we do not condone them. We sort of attempt to sharply distinguish between criminal and legal behavior.
Mr. Sidney Simons, a lawyer who has defended many Doukhobors in recent years, was asked whether he saw any resemblance between the Sons of Freedom who blow up bridges and the non-Doukhobor teenagers who resort to irrational violence of other kinds.
No, I don't think so at all. I think the delinquency that exists in our society results from an environmental thing in the nature of broken homes, broken families,
yes,
and economic difficulties.
But don't you think that has existed among the Doukhobors, with the children being sent to special school?
Well,
this kind of thing?
In that sense, yes, but it's not a natural environmental effect. It's one that is induced by mishandling of the situation by the authorities. And I think no other term can be given it.
Yes.
I think there is a direct relation between the persons who are now charged and tried and many convicted of crimes of violence in the Kootenays, and the same persons being in New Denver dormitories for anything between 1 and 4 years from 1952 onward.
You see, what you're involved in insofar as law enforcement is concerned, is not something which can be ignored or abated because someone has a peculiar set of views. In other words, if someone wants to blow up a church or a bridge, it is not a valid defense that he is doing so from religious motivation or any other motivation. This remains an offense under the criminal code.
Yes.
And law enforcement is defined and under the requirements of the Criminal Code of Canada. It is a crime and punishment relationship, and the punishment is thought in the words of our lawmakers in Ottawa to be a deterrent to normal people. It is not a basis of excusing a lawbreaker that the punishment is not a deterrent to him. And therefore, in the presence of proper evidence, which is secured from time to time, prosecution takes place. And there is no basis in law for anyone occupying this office or any law enforcement office in the land to excuse breaches of the criminal code for any ground whatever.
Nevertheless, there have been attempts to settle the differences between Doukhobors and the rest of Canadian society outside the courts of law. One of these was the Research Committee, which was set up by the provincial government in 1950 and recruited mainly from the faculty of the University of British Columbia.
Yes, it was felt the police, among others, are coming to feel that police methods alone were not enough to deal with the problem of the Doukhobors, and so they felt that perhaps some scientific, in the social scientific sense, investigation might find some long-run solutions to the problems that they're running into.
For 2 years, the committee considered every aspect of the Doukhobor problem. In the end, it brought in a series of recommendations. Some were implemented. Certain forms of legal discrimination against the Doukhobors were ended. Their form of marriage was recognized. The vote of which all Doukhobors were deprived provincially in 1931 and federally in 1934 was returned to them. The lands which they had lost in the foreclosure were sold back to them. But the major recommendation, that of resettling the Sons of Freedom, was never implemented.
Most of the leaders, or at least the more prominent spokesmen, indicated, as they do now, indicated at that time, a wish to emigrate, and if they're unable to do that, to at least relocate where they could live the sort of life that they professed they would like. So we spent a considerable time and found a potential area of settlement and recommended that the government, in a sense, underwrite the whole project. The sort of area in which they could carry on small-scale farming and logging, and there'd be possibly a therapeutic value to it, and at least a removal from contact with the groups in which they're coming in conflict, that over a period of years this might settle the whole situation down. The younger people would leave, move into other industries, other communities, and gradually this might Let me reread the whole thing.
Well, as a positive policy, you can't go around relocating people. There is no lawful means by which a government can say to a person or to a group of people not under sentence, you shall go and live in a certain community. That there is no provision for that in Canadian or British law. On the business of encouragement, there has been a long-standing offer of government, which has been recently defined, to be of assistance to any of these Sons of Freedom on an individual or family basis to locate and to take up what I would choose to call as a more normal type of life. That offer is continuing, and it is having some limited response at this time. But for mass resettlement, should that decision be taken, it will have to be taken on the initiative of the community itself. And quite frankly, I don't think it is part of the legitimate aspiration of government to encourage a mass movement of people. This has to be their decision based on individual reaction in each case.
Some people offer only a political solution to be reached through narrowly observing the letter of the law. Others suggest an economic and social solution through resettlement or relocation. There remains one more possibility, a moral solution.
I think in the last analysis that Doukhobor as being people, it is people who are the means of assistance. Not money, not legal decisions, but if there could be brought about a situation in which people who are competent, sympathetic, talented in any one of various fields could live amongst the people who are at the present time restless and an embarrassment to government, then surely in this way there may be some hope, there may be some solution found to this dilemma, which does seem to embarrass and confuse not only the governmental authorities but the people of the province.
You think in terms of something like a kind of Peace Corps showing the goodwill of the rest of the population towards the Doukhobors?
Yes.
And do you think the Doukhobors would accept that? Do you think they would welcome people who went to that intent?
I have found that they welcome friendship, and they have always been suspicious of outsiders, but if certainly on the other hand, they are very responsive to true help, to if a person goes in with integrity, the desire to understand and to like them and to be of whatever help possible, then there are many possibilities.
A Peace Corps or the police. Before we decide, let us ask ourselves how far we too may have been responsible for the failure of our democracy over 60 years to find a means of living with one of its minorities. In social conflicts, the blame is never all on one side.